Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to Yeshiva YouTube Table and Able. Today we're doing Simon Kuf Ches 188. Nusach Bracha Shlishis V'nei Berkas Hamazon B'Shabbos V'Atov Berkas Hamazon. Different additions that you'd say in Berkas Hamazon. What happens if you forget these additions? Most people are familiar with these things, but not the specifics of the halacha. We'll talk about it today. Aleph Achash Chasam Boni Yerushalayim Yana Amein Achar Berkas Atzmo. If you look in most texts, most Sidurim, when you say, or most benchers, everyone has those benchers from those weddings and bar mitzvahs you go to. Why do people do that? I heard originally that it was started by all for the boss, Yaakov Yosef Herman. In the early 1900s, he was in America. He was very, he got into a lot of simchas, and people weren't that from back then. There was no Lakewood then. There was barely a borough park, maybe. People. I think all the from people lived in the Bronx, or Lower East Side of Manhattan. I think that's where he lived. And he would go to these bar mitzvahs, these weddings, and they wouldn't know the benching. They didn't have siddurim with them. So he instituted. He said everyone, when they make a simcha, they should give a bencher, so people will know the benching. And that, I think, started the minhag. Everyone gives a bencher. Problem is, it costs way too much money, and nowadays we all have it on our phones, right? All right, people stop this minute. It's enough already. People have drawers filled with all these benchers of all these friends, their real dear friends at the weddings they go to, of them and their kids and their grandkids. Aleph. You should say Amen, right? That's a text. You say Amen. Amen. The reason that they instituted say the word Amen, not because you're supposed to say Amen on your own bracha, rather because to signify that the first brachas are Daraisa, the third bracha Tov Amen was only Rabbanon. Beis Amen Zeh Yomeinu Balachash. When you say Amen Zeh, this Amen, you should say it quietly. When you're benching yourself, we'll see in a second. If people hear you saying Amen out loud, they'll say, why is he doing that? Oh, the first three brachas Daraisa. They're not going to be careful. It's only when you're benching yourself. When you're benching as a mezumin, you want to say the people who answer should say it out loud, and you also should say it out loud. Right? Everyone else who hears your third bracha, they're going to say amen after you. So it'll drown out the amen they're saying. You're saying it out loud, and therefore no one will mizalzel, no one will disgrace bracha tov ametim. The minhag in our medinos, the omro b'kol ram, afilim avarech atzmo k'shemazamnin. The minhag is to say it out loud. V'ulaihu mahaytaima. For this reason. Gimel sarach lahazker bracha shlishis malchus beis David. You're supposed to mention Malchus Beit David, right? Say Malchus Beit David Mashichecha. Ein lahasker bashul Malchus Acher. You shouldn't mention add on to the bracha. Most people don't add on to the text, but if you're thinking about adding on, don't add on the different Malchus. Omer uMalchuscha Malchus Beit David Mashichecha Toa. Even if you say the Malchus of Hashem, she'ein lahashvos Malchus of the Aroi Malchus of the Shmai, it's a disgrace to Hashem to compare even Malchus Beit David. Compare that to Hashem is a disgrace. Ein lomer ba Avinu Malkenu. You also shouldn't say Avinu Malkenu. I guess that's straight out of Yom Noraim. Don't say Avinu Malkenu. Hagav Yeshon Da'ak Omer Yalav Yavo Lo Yisai Melech Chanun V'Rachum Ali Dalig Milas Melech V'Svar Nachon Hi Avalo Risi Nogin Kain. When you say Yalav Yavo, at the end of Yalav Yavo, the text you say Melech Chanun V'Rachum. So you're mentioning the Malchus of Hashem. You're not supposed to mention that's part of the bracha, the third bracha, Boni Yerushalayim. So some have a minhag not to say that. But he says people are not knowing to do that because that's the text we have, so it's not considered adding anything on. Okay, halacha dalid. Nusach bracha zu poseach barachem Hashem Elokeinu onachmenu Hashem Elokeinu. The Gemara records that there are different minhagim. Some people used to say rachem, some people say nachem. Some people switched it off on Shabbos during the week. Chosim ba'boni Yerushalayim menachem sion b'boni Yerushalayim, either Nechama or Rachem. Ve'ein l'shanos hanusach v'Shabbos l'chol. The Mishnah Berurah passes, the Shulchan Aruch paskins. Whatever you say during the week, you can choose either one. You can say Nachem during the week and say Nachem on Shabbos, or Rachim during the week and Rachim on Shabbos. The Bein b'Shabbos Hem L'chol Omer Nuscha Achas. Hagav Yesh Omrim the Omrim Boni Barachma B'Shalayim B'Chei Nogin. They add the word Rachamim Boni Barachma because we do start our minhag to say Rachim, and you end it off Boni Yerushalayim. We add the word Barachma to fit with the Hatcha, the Haskala, the beginning of the bracha. Hey, b'Shabbos Omer Bar Ritzei V'Hachlitzenu. If you're not familiar with this, then maybe you're Baal Tshuva. The first time you're learning this. So on Shabbos you add in Ritzei. In addition, you add to Berkas Hamazon Rosh Chodesh V'Yom Tov V'Chol Shal Moed Omer Yalav Yavu. You add Yalav Yavu. B'Chal Echad Mehem b'Shabbos. Let's say Yom Tov fall on Shabbos. Omer Ritzei V'Hachlitzenu. V'Achach Yalav Yavu. First you say Ritzei, because Shabbos happens more often than Yom Tov. Tadir Risheno Tadir Tadir Konim. Eino Maskel Shal Shabbos V'Yalav Yavu. Lo Shal Yom Tov V'Chol Shal Moed Rosh Chodesh Ritzei V'Hachlitzenu. Each of them are independent, so therefore you can't mix the two together. One is Ritzei for Shabbos, and the other one is for Yom Tov or Chol HaMoed or Rosh Chodesh. Vav Tav Lo Hizker Shal Shabbos. If you made a mistake and forgot saying Shal Shabbos, Omer Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam Shnasan Shabbos L'Menucha L'Amo Yisrael Ba'aval Os L'Bris Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadesh Shabbos. Most people are not familiar with this nusach, and most benchers, that's the problem. Most benchers they give out don't have this nusach. So if you're stuck and you're using one of those benchers, you're in trouble. If you look in the Sidurim, they have. This is a halacha. I'll tell you in a second when you actually say this. If you made a mistake and you forgot to say Yalav Yava, Omer Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam Asher Nasan Yamim Tovim Li Yisrael L'Sasan L'Simcha Es Yom Chag HaPloni Hazeh, whatever Chag it is, whether it's Shavuos or Pesach. Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadesh Yisrael V'Hazmanim V'Mchal B'Yom Tov B'Shabbos. Let's say Yom Tov fell on Shabbos and you didn't say either Ritzei or Yalav Yava. Omer Shenasan Shabbos L'Menucha L'Amo Yisrael B'Aval Os L'Bris V'Yamim Tovim L'Sasan L'Simcha Es Yom Chag Ploni, whatever Chag it is. Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadesh Shabbos Yisrael V'Hazmanim. Then you do combine the two. The Kol Brachos Halalu B'Shem U'Malchus. You say them with Hashem's name. It's in place of saying, because you're adding on. Really, you missed saying Ritzei and Yalav Yavo. So you have to have a new bracha in order to fit it into the bracha. Right? It has to be part of a bracha. The only case, right, is it's a halacha which doesn't apply so often, right? Because if you forgot to say, if you didn't finish the bracha of Boni Yerushalayim, right? You said bracha da Hashem, and then you remember, so you say Lamdeni Chukecha, and you go back and you say Ritzei or Yalav Yavo, but you said you already said Boni Yerushalayim, and then you remembered before you started Tov Meitiv. Because if you already started at Tov Meitiv, now starting at Tov Meitiv means that I said bracha da Hashem Elokeinu Avinu, whatever. But if you say Baruch Atah Hashem in Hatov Meitiv, then you can say Lamdeni Chukecha. Or if you said Baruch Atah or Baruch Atah Hashem, so then you would go back to Ritzei and then finish Boni Yerushalayim. This only happens if you didn't say any words of Baruch Atah Meitiv and you finish Boni Yerushalayim, but you didn't say any words of Tov Meitiv. So then you say this brachos. You started saying Atov Meitiv, meaning you said more than Baruch Atah Hashem. You said Baruch Atah Hashem, you say Baruch Atah Hashem, and you go back and say, you don't say this bracha, you actually go back to Ritzei and Yalav Yavo in the middle of Boni Yerushalayim and finish Boni Yerushalayim. So if this happens, if you started saying Atov Meitiv, then you have to go back to the beginning of Berkas Hamazon. You already lost your opportunity. Zion, let's say it was Rosh Chodesh, and you didn't say Yalav Yavo and bench. Maybe Yom one other day, the night. If the same mistake happens, you remember right before I told Meitiv, and you already said Boni Yerushalayim, you say this, but you don't end off with a Baruch Atah Hashem. This is only again in this instance where you remembered before Tov Meitiv. The Mishnah Berurah notes that also, you look in the Sidur and they say there's also Rosh Chodesh also, even though you don't really have to go back for Rosh Chodesh, but the Nusach is to say it with Shem Malchus. You know, the Shulchan Aruch says not to say it with Shem Malchus. If you look in the Sidurim, you would say Baruch Atah Hashem at the end of this bracha. Once you started saying Tov Meitiv, you said more than Baruch Atah Hashem. Elokeinu Avinu, Einu Zunenu, Eino Chozer. You don't go back. On Rosh Chodesh, that falls during the week, not on Shabbos, so there's no obligation to eat bread. It's a nice thing to eat bread. My wife's family has a minhag of ordering pizza or having some fancy food on Rosh Chodesh, but you don't have to. So therefore, there's no obligation to eat bread. There's no obligation to bench. I mean, if you eat bread, you have to bench, but you don't have to start eating bread to bench, so therefore there's no chiyuv to mention Yalav Yavo, so therefore you don't have to go back. V'chol hamoed dinach Rosh Chodesh. Also on Chol Hamoed you don't have to eat bread. It's recommended to eat bread. You don't have to. I'll go after the Chol Makom. Usually Omer V'soch Shar Rachaman. But the Rambam says maybe if you didn't say Yalav Yavo on Chol Hamoed Rosh Chodesh, you say it in Harachman. When it's barley el siman sof kuf pei zayin and gabe al nisan, like we said yesterday. For al nisan, v'lai yishtachalik ki Yalav Yavo yishvo askar she'elas ve'en la'amro levatol kinin ar levechai nogen. Our minhag is like the Rambam says that you would not make this on Harachman because you're saying the shemos of Hashem. It's only appropriate to say it in the right place. Harachman is not the right place. Im chal Rosh Chodesh b'Shabbos. Let's say Shabbos happened to be Rosh Chodesh. V'hizkir shal Shabbos. You said Ritzei. V'lo hizkir shal Rosh Chodesh, but you didn't say Yalav Yavo for Rosh Chodesh. V'lo nizkir shehizkal tov ha'meitiv. You already started saying tov ha'meitiv. Ain't no choser. You don't have to be choser because Shabbos you have to eat bread for Shabbos, but you already said Ritzei. Yalav Yavo you didn't have to eat bread for Rosh Chodesh. Let's say you said Rosh Chodesh, Yalav Yavo. Shabbos fell out on Rosh Chodesh, but Rosh Chodesh fell out on Shabbos. But you didn't say Ritzei. Kolel Rosh Chodesh and Shabbos. If you're saying this bracha, meaning you remember before I told V'Ameitiv, and you say the bracha, you include Rosh Chodesh, even though you said Yalav Yavo with Shabbos. Omer Shnasan Shabbos L'Menucha Rosh Chodeshim L'Zikaron. In Pasuk about Tov V'Ameitiv, if you started at Tov V'Ameitiv, Chozel Rosh Berkas Hamazon U'Maskil Shabbos Rosh Chodesh, you missed the integral part. Ritzei. You have to go back. And when you repeat Birkas Hamazon, you would say again, because now your first one didn't count, so you have to say Yalav Yavo and Ritzei. V'yesh misha Omer Shem Shachach Shel Shabbos Rosh Chodesh V'nisar Kodesh Hizkal Tov Ha'meitiv Omer Shnatan Shabbos L'Menucha Rosh Chodeshim L'Zikaron V'chosim Mishal Shabbos Ve'no Chosim Mishal Rosh Chodesh. Right? Even though in the bracha that you're making up, you mention Rosh Chodesh, but the Chasima is only of Shabbos, not Rosh Chodesh. I think this is the halacha. I'm sorry. Achron in the Mishnah Berurah says that you should also say Rosh Chodesh. I mean, technically, you can just open up a siddur and see what the siddur says, because they're probably possibly in the Mishnah Berurah that you would end off saying Rosh Chodesh in the end, the conclusion of the bracha also. Chet, Suda Shlishis B'Shabbos Dinak Rosh Chodesh, right? Even though it's recommended to have bread for Shalosh Shudas, you don't have to have bread. So therefore, it's like Rosh Chodesh. Forget Ritzei for in Shalosh Shudas, you don't have to go back. Tet, Shlosh Sha'achlu B'Shabbosos V'Yom Tov V'Shachu LaHaskir Meina Ma'ora. 3 people, right? They have a zimun, and they forgot. All 3 of them forgot to say. They haven't stricken lachzor the Rosh Chodesh, the Rosh Berkas Hamazon. They all have to go back because they didn't say Ritzei or they didn't say Yalav Yavo and Yonto. Yivarach kol echad b'fnei atzmo ki midei zimun kfar yatzu. Technically, even though their Berkas Hamazon was invalidated, but their zimun, they're joining together somehow. We'll have to explain as we got the Hilchos Zimun. Somehow it was created nonetheless, and therefore they bench independently. Yud haya ochal v'yatzu Shabbos. This is halacha which happens a lot of times. You're eating, you start Shalosh Shudas, and you continue eating Shalosh Shudas until it's very dark. Some people eat Shalosh Shudas in the very dark. Maskil Shal Shabbos B'Berkas Hamazon. Nonetheless, you go after the beginning of your meal, and you ate bread during the beginning of your meal. If you ate at least a kazayas, which technically, according to most poskim, was enough to at least say Berkas Hamazon, that's lina and basar haskalas suda. You go after the beginning of your meal. The beginning of your meal was on Shabbos. Similarly, if you start a meal of Rosh Chodesh or Purim or Chanukah right before Shkia, and you ate a kazayas before Shkia, so then even though the meal finished, let's say Purim, as this Purim happened to finish very late, you would mention Yalav, you would mention Al Nisim or Purim or Chanukah, or Rosh Chodesh you mention Yalav Yavo, because you go after the beginning of the meal. Now, a question comes up a lot in halacha: what happens if Rosh Chodesh is Motzei Shabbos, right? So now you're eating bread before Shkia, which you have to mention Ritzei, and then you're also eating bread after Seis, right, or after Shkia. So maybe it's tomorrow already, Rosh Chodesh, you have to mention Rosh Chodesh. What do you do then? Do you mention Ritzei for the beginning of the meal on Rosh Chodesh? But it's hard to do this, right, because you're saying it's both Shabbos and Motzei Shabbos at the same time. That's a problem in halacha. And if you ask modern day poskim, they'll give you an advice. They'll tell you, and most people are machmir on this. They say don't, you have to eat a kazayas before Shkia, and don't eat anything after Shkia. Or my Rosh Yeshiva told me until 20 minutes after Shkia, make sure to eat the bread. If you eat after 20 minutes, then you're stuck. You gotta either you mention Yalav Yavo. If it's before 20 minutes, you say. We'll talk about this in Ian to lean on what the correct halacha is. I'm going to give you a definitive psak, and I'll tell you why I give that psak, Ian to lean on, coming up next.